What does it mean to own water? Perhaps it's like owning property. We all have a good sense of what it means to own land, but what does it mean to own water? Something that is continually on the move, unlike land. What difference would it make to conceive the Colorado River Basin in terms of property rights to water, rather than in whatever we think of it today? Our first speaker today, Professor Jason Robison of the University of Wyoming's College of Law, has thought through a lot of these questions and issues. He's an expert on water law in both its local and its international forms. He has written, lectured, and published extensively on the Colorado River Basin, the Compact, and its implementation in water law. He's also worked on the legal controversies surrounding the Yellowstone River Basin, as well as comparisons of water law around the world. Recent publications and research has included both the Indus River in Pakistan and water rights and law in the Andean Mountains. Professor Robison began his academic career locally, earning his undergraduate degree from the University of Utah, just over the border. He went on to do his JD at the University of Oregon before gaining his SJD at Harvard in water law from the law school there. He joined the UW Law School in 2013, where he's now an award-winning associate professor, having just won the Chief Washakie Foundation Distinguished Leadership Award. His recent research activities have brought together a number of experts, some of whom are in this room, who we'll hear from this evening, in a book of collected essays called Vision and Place, John Wesley Powell and the Reimagining of the Colorado River Basin. And I'm going to let Jason come up and talk today about Powell's Grand Canyon, a Centennial Perspective. Jason.
Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. John Wesley Powell named the Grand Canyon 150 years ago during his 1869 expedition. 50 years later, Grand Canyon was established as a national park. So this year marks not just the Sesquicentennial of Powell's 1869 expedition, but also Grand Canyon National Park's centennial. And my presentation is all about the confluence of those two strands of Western history. Part of the presentation will focus on Powell's trip through Grand Canyon and his work in the West. Most of the presentation, though, will revolve around Grand Canyon as a place. It's a place shaped by geological processes, by ecological processes that are perpetual. It's also a place that lives in people's hearts and in people's minds, their thoughts and their emotions. People have values toward Grand Canyon, with those values influenced by visual art, like what my colleague Pat Keycut will discuss in his presentation in about an hour. In addition, though, Grand Canyon is a place shaped by law, legal boundaries superimposed on the landscape going back for more than a century. That's my angle. That's where I work. We can see this pattern not just in relation to the national park, but, quote, the entire Grand Canyon, from the mouth of the Paria River to the Grand Wash Cliffs, including tributary side canyons and surrounding plateaus. This text appears in the 1975 Grand Canyon National Park Enlargement Act, which goes on to describe the canyon as, quote, a natural feature of national and international significance. I could not agree more wholeheartedly. So this presentation, it's all about lines on a map. Lines on a map that have been superimposed on Grand Canyon. How do these lines connect to Powell? What are the lines exactly? I've broken the presentation into 4 sections to consider these questions. The first section is going to look at Powell's 1869 expedition in historical context. I hope you find some of that material illuminating. Second section will then look at the lines on the map related to Native Americans in Grand Canyon. Third section, in turn, will go to public lands, including Grand Canyon National Park's creation at the front end of the 20th century. And the final section will be devoted to the sculptor of the Grand Canyon, the Colorado River. My takeaway, what I really want you to get out of the next hour, is this. Grand Canyon has become a creature of law over the past 100 years, since the national park's creation, and even before. This is the basis of a Centennial issue that I wrote up for some folks down in Arizona who are putting together an issue of the Journal of Arizona History focused on Grand Canyon Centennial. Grand Canyon as a creature of law. If that interests you, take a look at the document when it comes out. That'll be in the fall. So, turning to the first section. Human beings have been in Grand Canyon a long time. The main focus of this initial section, as mentioned earlier, is to put Powell's 1869 expedition into historical context in this way. According to the National Park Service, the oldest human artifacts in Grand Canyon, in the Grand Canyon region, date to about 12,000 years ago. There has been, quote, continuous use and occupation of the park since that time. This picture depicts a major excavation that occurred along the Colorado River in Grand Canyon National Park from 2007 to 2009. Most of the sites that were excavated date to between 1000 and 1250 AD, when ancestral Puebloan peoples lived and farmed along the river. Hell, I'd enjoy raising my family along a river like that. First European to see Grand Canyon was Garcia Lopez de Cardenas. Cardenas was part of the Coronado Expedition that took place between 1540 and 1542, seeking out, you know the story, the 7 cities of gold, the 7 cities of Cibola. There's a spur route that Cardenas took along the expedition that went from here through the Hopi villages to the crest of Grand Canyon. Cardenas solicited the assistance of Hopi guides to take him to see the edge of the canyon and to see the Colorado River. He wasn't able to make it down to the river, though. Cardenas never made it down to the river. He only saw it from a distance. Nonetheless, that was the first European to see the Grand Canyon and Colorado River. Other Spanish explorers also traveled throughout the Southwest over the following 2 centuries. Perhaps the most well-known for most of us in this room, certainly me as a native Utahn, is the Dominguez Escalante expedition, which was tasked with finding a route from Santa Fe, New Mexico to missions in Monterey, California. There is, of course, the Great Basin between those 2 areas of the West. The route that they took westbound, entailed their crossing the Green River here and the Colorado River here. Once they hit the western slope of the Wasatch Mountains, Utah Lake, where they saw indigenous peoples and camped with indigenous peoples, they thought better of it. They thought better of trying to cross the Great Basin. They abandoned their quest and proceeded to try to find a way home. On that return route, the eastbound route, they skirted the northern end of the Grand Canyon region and ultimately had to cross the Colorado River, finding it almost impossible to do so. But they ended up pulling it off, and you may know the location where they did. This is the Crossing of the Fathers. This crossing point is located just north of modern-day Glen Canyon Dam. It's now submerged and called Padres Bay. I'll note that the expedition's timing, the Dominguez Escalante expedition's timing, was conspicuous. It occurred in 1776, at the time on the East Coast when the American Revolution began. The Constitution's framing, the U.S. Constitution's framing, followed 11 years later in 1787, and approximately 60 years after that, the United States assumed ownership of and sovereignty over the territory that encompasses Grand Canyon. This occurred through this instrument, the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War. The treaty created a new southern boundary between the United States and Mexico, the Gila River in Arizona. And it's ultimately because of this international law that the Grand Canyon became what we know as the Grand Canyon today. How so? How do you think that the treaty operated in that way? It applied the U.S. Constitution to Grand Canyon. Through the treaty, the U.S. Constitution came to govern the Southwest, including the Grand Canyon area. So this is the cession of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo here. Grand Canyon is obviously located in the heart of that section and in the heart of the Colorado River Plateau. And there are many provisions within the U.S. Constitution that are important when we think about how Grand Canyon's legal status changed with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But I'll flag one, and no doubt it's one that's familiar to Westerners both here and elsewhere throughout the region. That's the property clause. The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. The property clause is arguably the most important aspect of the U.S. Constitution to adhere to the space that ended up being Grand Canyon. How so? That's largely what the rest of my presentation will focus on. Segueing in that direction, the United States, of course, needed to get a sense of what property it had acquired through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And I think we probably all know, to some extent, how that occurred. One gentleman who was involved in this surveying of the newly acquired property was Joseph Christmas Ives. He led a survey from 1857 to 1858 that entailed not heading down the Green and Colorado rivers from the headwaters areas, but heading up the Colorado River from its mouth, from the delta. This is the steamboat that was used for the Ives expedition, and here is the route that traces what exactly Ives did. It's particularly this portion of the route that's the most important. This overland route is not a major focus for me. It's this portion. Ives went from the mouth of the Colorado River as far upstream as Black Canyon, adjacent to where Hoover Dam is built today. From this vantage point, guess what Ives did? He looked eastward, and he could see into the canyon. He wasn't as creative as Powell, though, wasn't as good at assigning names to landscapes. He brought back the first sketches of what he called, quote, the Big Canyon of the Colorado, and famously predicted, quote, that this valueless region would be forever unvisited and undisturbed. How wrong he was. Powell came next. This map depicts the 1869 expedition's journey from May 24th to August 30th of 1869. Powell, true to his character, did Ives one better, and he named Grand Canyon not Big Canyon, how boring and banal, but Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon. The expedition spent a total of 26 days in the region, from August 4th at the mouth of the Paria River to August 30th at the mouth of the Virgin River. It proved to be a crucible for the crew, given their exhaustion, near starvation, and general disorientation. One testament of this crucible dynamic, the way Grand Canyon tested their mettle, has to do with the departure of Oramel Howland, Seneca Howland, and William Dunn at Separation Rapid on August 28th. Mark it, 2 days before the expedition concluded at the mouth of the Virgin River. Those gentlemen ended up scaling the canyon. They ended up on the Shivwitz Plateau, and they ended up murdered. Whether the murders occurred at the hands of native tribes or Mormon settlers, well, we'll let history be the judge of that one. Powell's most famous quote came from the canyon. It's from his August 13th journal entry at the confluence of the Little Colorado and Colorado Rivers. I'm going to read it. We are now ready to start on our way down the great unknown. Our boats, tied to a common stake, are chafing each other as they are tossed by the fretful river. We have an unknown distance yet to run, an unknown river yet to explore. What falls there are, we know not. What rocks beset the channel, we know not. What walls rise over the river, we know not. Ah, well, we may conjecture many things. That great unknown metaphor is a good one. I'll expand on it this evening at the panel. Okay, so the expedition propelled Powell to fame in the United States. It laid the foundation for a career that would make him the most knowledgeable non-Indian person about the American West in his generation. Some of Powell's work would focus on Native Americans, especially his job as director of the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology. Powell also, however, did a lot of work on public lands. The most famous thing he wrote in this area, you may have heard of it, the 1878 Arid Lands Report. It was published twice. The 1878 date is the original one. 1879 is on here because it was so popular they needed another publication round. Based on his interest in public lands and water, Powell ultimately advocated for this: organizing the American West as a region, which he called the arid region, into a conglomeration of watershed commonwealths. What those watershed commonwealths are about is a subject that I'm not going to delve into now because I want you to come to this evening's panel. But this was his vision for how Euro-Americans should settle, if we want to put it that way, or colonize, if we want to put it another way, the arid region of the United States. All of these aspects of Powell's work will be illuminated more tonight. Suffice it to say, Powell's watershed commonwealths idea didn't pan out. It fell flat. Some of his other ideas, though, they did get traction. They did gain traction during his generation. I'll return to them when discussing the lines on the map that have emerged to carve up Grand Canyon into the space it is today, this conglomeration of legal spaces as I've mentioned it. I'm going to begin this line drawing survey, if you will, with Native Americans. Powell did not escape the prejudices of his time. He viewed Native Americans as culturally inferior and advocated for their segregation onto reservations where they could learn Euro-American ways and ultimately be prepared for integration into mainstream U.S. society. He was a colonialist, and Powell's viewpoint proved very influential in Grand Canyon. This map is from the Park Service, the National Park Service. It depicts the 11 tribes that have traditional connections with Grand Canyon that date back to before the Roman Empire, before the Golden Age of Greece, millennia. There are 11 tribes in total: Havasupai, Hualapai, Hopi, Navajo, Yavapai Apache, and a host of Paiute bands located primarily in the Great Basin here. How has law shaped Grand Canyon since the Centennial and earlier in regards to these tribes' ancient connections to Grand Canyon as a place? How has it done by these tribes? Only a couple highlights are possible in addressing these questions. Here's one. There's an 1849 treaty formed between the Navajo and the federal government that marks the first development in this realm. The treaty connected to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that had been formed by the United States and Mexico the year before. Specifically, through the treaty, the Navajo tribe was, quote, lawfully placed under the exclusive jurisdiction and protection of the government of the United States. In addition to connecting to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, this 1849 treaty also foreshadowed the future for the Navajo and other tribes with ties that bind to Grand Canyon. The treaty provided the United States shall, at its earliest convenience, designate, settle, and adjust the tribe's territorial boundaries and pass and execute in their territory such laws as may be deemed conducive to the prosperity and happiness of said Indians. So much for that promise. 15 years later, the federal government forcibly removed the Navajo from their homeland, Kit Carson burning them out, and relocated the tribe to Bosque Redondo for 4 years of inhumanity. 2 decades after the 1849 treaty, the Navajo endured what you may know as the Long Walk. The Navajo survived, though, because that's what indigenous peoples do. And they formed a new treaty. They formed a treaty creating a reservation on a small portion of their traditional homelands. A treaty setting apart that reservation for the tribe's use and occupation. Notably, the treaty text resembles the treaty text of the 1868 Treaty of Fort Bridger creating Wind River just to the north of here. The treaty promised that this reserved land would be the tribe's, quote, permanent home, and it secured a promise from the tribes to the federal government that the tribes would make no permanent settlement elsewhere. So these Navajo treaties, 1849 and 1868, represent the front end of the laws applied to the tribes with traditional connections to Grand Canyon. The back end of these laws, because I can't go through the middle, concerns this tribe, the Havasupai. Their connection to Grand Canyon is nothing less than umbilical. They're inseparable from the place. This is captured in this 1903 picture from photographer and ethnologist Edward Curtis, and it's captured in the title of the photograph, Home of the Havasupai. An 1880 executive order had created a reservation, a small reservation for the Havasupai in Grand Canyon. Thankfully, fast forward in time to 1975 and the self-determination era of federal Indian policy, and this act created an enlarged Havasupai reservation in the canyon, 185,000 acres. The act was aimed at improving, quote, the social, cultural, and economic life of tribal members in their homeland, though numerous exceptions would come to apply to the uses that tribal members could make of their homeland. Notably, the 1975 Act also provided the Havasu tribe access to another portion of their traditional lands. These are called Havasupai use lands. There's about 95,000, maybe 93,000 acres of these. Again, though, with restrictions on the types of uses tribal members can make to this portion of their homeland. Bottom line, I'm going to go to the upshot. The upshot of this indigenous space section of my presentation is that federal law was used to create indigenous spaces within Grand Canyon. That is, to create reservations segregating tribes with traditional connections to Grand Canyon from the canyon itself. This occurred for all 11 tribes identified by the National Park Service through different types of laws: treaties, executive orders, presidential proclamations, statutes, down the line. Although different legal instruments were used, the result was the same: physical and cultural separation of profound importance for the tribe's cultural integrity. What we might call, if we're being honest about it, legalized colonization. On that happy note, we're going to turn to another area of legal spaces created within Grand Canyon. Another area where the property clause of the U.S. Constitution has had play. Focus, if you would, on the non-yellow colored portions of this map. So ignore these, if you would. It's these other portions that are the focal point of the next 15 minutes or so. The 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo sure in the hell did not draw the non-yellowed portions of land on this map there. Nor did those other colored portions appear on the map in the half-decade after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Instead, that half-century was spent in a way that John Wesley Powell contemplated and advocated for, disposing of the public domain. Then, toward the end of the 19th century, in the 1890s, the federal government took another tact. It decided to start creating federal reservations out of the public domain instead of trying to wholesale that land into private hands. Forest reserves, later known as national forests, were the initial legal space carved out. Forest-related developments at Grand Canyon were part of national developments that some of you may know about based on your knowledge of U.S. history. 1891 saw the enactment of the Forest Reserve Act that authorized the president to create timber reserves where the disposal era public land laws, like the Homestead Act, wouldn't have play. In turn, the 1897 Forest Service Organic Act reiterated this charge to create forest reservations and identified the purposes of such reservations. Quote, to improve and protect the forest within the reservation, or for the purpose of securing favorable conditions of water flows, and to furnish a continuous supply of timber. These two national acts sandwiched the first federal forest reservation at Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon National Forest was created in 1893, right in the middle of those two acts. This forest, later in time, would morph into the Kaibab National Forest and the Coconino National Forest, which are still part of the Grand Canyon region today. Two other public lands developments occurred during this time as well, though. One of them's minor, one of them's real important. The initial minor one involved this 1906 act authorizing the president to designate such areas in Grand Canyon National Forest as should be set aside for the protection of game animals and be recognized as a breeding place therefore. Anyone want to guess what U.S. president took up Congress on this offer? Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt. He exercised authority under the act to create the Grand Canyon National Game Preserve in 1909. Its boundaries ended up shifting over time just like the national forest boundaries have ended up shifting over time. But the point is, it's a separate kind of legal space that exists within Grand Canyon today. All that said, something much bigger occurred in 1906 that I would be absolutely remiss, derelict, not to mention. Congress passed the Antiquities Act, the 1906 Antiquities Act. It authorized the president to declare by presidential proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest that are situated upon the lands owned or controlled by the United States to be national monuments. Wyoming's got the first. Devil's Tower, or as the Lakota call it, Bear's Lodge. But, more to the point here, Teddy Roosevelt's 1908 proclamation creating Grand Canyon National Monument. To be clear, this is the first of two national monuments that would bear this exact name. The proclamation issued by Roosevelt tracked the Antiquities Act's text, describing, quote, "The Grand Canyon of the Colorado River is an object of unusual scientific interest, being the greatest eroded canyon within the United States." This map reflects the creation of this new type of legal space, national monuments. So thus far, we have the national forest, we have a national game preserve, we now have a national monument, all encumbering, all applied to, created within Grand Canyon. Can you anticipate what happened next? History was made. That's John Muir with Teddy Roosevelt. A landmark event for American preservationism as embodied by John Muir versus American conservationism as embodied by Gifford Pinchot took place. Congress created in 1916 the National Park Service within the Department of Interior. The statute that created the Park Service charged the agency with administering national parks, monuments, and other reservations, and articulated the purpose of these designations: to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Thanks for thinking of my kids, Congress. I do appreciate it. Then a new legal space was created at Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon National Park was established in 1919 during Woodrow Wilson's presidency. As described by Wilson, or in the act, I should say, there is hereby reserved and withdrawn from settlement, occupancy, or disposal under the laws of the United States, and dedicated and set apart as a public park for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, the Grand Canyon National Park. Anybody want to guess what happened to Grand Canyon National Monument when this went down? It ended up being incorporated into the park. The next major milestone for the park didn't take place until 1975, so 56 years later, to be precise about it. There's some stuff that happened in the interim, though, that I think you'll find interesting, and that's certainly relevant to my overall narrative of legal spaces. If you thought we were done with national monuments upon the abolition of Grand Canyon National Monument when the park was created, wrong. Herbert Hoover, in 1932, during the Depression, created a second Grand Canyon National Monument under the Antiquities Act. This new monument covered land located downstream along the Colorado River from Grand Canyon National Park. But downstream protection alone, that wasn't enough. This is Marble Canyon. It's located upstream from Grand Canyon National Park, adjacent to Lee Ferry. Guess what would be this beautiful place's fate? National Monument. It was conferred national monument status by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1969, again, under the Antiquities Act. So Herbert Hoover, 1932, Lyndon B. Johnson, 1969. But if indeed history is cyclical, if time is cyclical instead of being linear, guess what would be the fate of these national monuments? they'd be incorporated into an enlarged version of Grand Canyon National Park in 1975. This map from the Grand Canyon Trust does an excellent job illustrating the relative sizes of the 1919 National Park versus the 1975 National Park, plus other reservations. You can see the upstream and the downstream locations that previously had fallen within the national monuments, Hoover's and Johnson's, incorporated into the enlarged version of the park. Here's the federal law that grew this legal space, the Grand Canyon National Park Enlargement Act. Congress enacted it in 1975 during Gerald Ford's administration. The key text: in order to add to the Grand Canyon National Park certain prime portions of the canyon area possessing unique natural, scientific, and scenic values, the Grand Canyon National Park shall comprise 1,200,000 acres. And just to be clear, this is the same statute that also ended up enlarging the Havasu Tribe's reservation. All right, moving forward. Since 1975 and the enlargement of Grand Canyon National Park at that time, a couple strands of developments have occurred. Again, I think you might find these interesting. One strand stems from an amendment that took place later during the same year, 1975, and called for the study of something new: wilderness areas. Wilderness areas. So, if you fast forward about a decade, in 1984, Congress passed a statute that designated 7 wilderness areas in the Grand Canyon region. As with the national forests, the national monuments, the national park, this was a new type of legal space created by federal law. I note there's no wilderness area within Grand Canyon National Park itself. The Park Service has put forth a wilderness proposal that would call for 1,143,918 acres of the park to be designated as wilderness. That's equivalent to about 94% of the park's total land base. But that proposal has not yet had traction. I'll note also the conspicuous locations of several of these wilderness areas, particularly here and here. They're located within 2 post-enlargement national monuments. More specifically, that's the Wave in Vermilion Cliffs National Monument. One of the wilderness areas falls here. It was designated in 2000 under the Clinton administration. Second, this is Grand Canyon Parashant National Monument. 4 of the wilderness areas, partly or wholly, fall within this national monument, again, established in 2000 under the Clinton administration. So these post-enlargement wilderness areas and national monuments are one important strand of developments that are notable, but they're terrestrial. They concern the landscape proper, which distinguishes them from a second strand. And you may know where I'm headed now. Much attention has been paid over the past several decades to Grand Canyon's airspace. The 1987 National Parks Overflights Act reflects one key concern, and that is the significant adverse effects of aircraft overflights on the natural quiet and experience of the park. Natural quiet, protection of natural quiet, and visitor experience. To restore the park's natural quiet and to protect the visitor experience, flight routes have been designated throughout Grand Canyon. Flight elevation restrictions have been imposed. Quiet aircraft technology requirements have been established, and operational caps have been applied to commercial tours. In these ways, law is attempting to construct Grand Canyon's airspace. But not only in this way. Air pollution has been another major issue for Grand Canyon. There are several different air quality issues that I could touch on, but the most prominent has been regional haze, which results not just from forest fires, but also interstate transport of industrial and urban pollution. The Federal Clean Air Act applies in this space. It was amended in 1990 to establish a Grand Canyon visibility Transport Commission. And in turn, this commission issued recommendations in 1996. They are currently being implemented to try to help with haze, regional haze issues in Grand Canyon through the Environmental Protection Agency and a federal-state partnership called the Western Regional Air Partnership. Now, I'm mindful that a wide scope of material has been covered so far in regards to public lands, but we're not done. It's not about the details of all the laws that have been canvassed thus far, but the basic point. Grand Canyon has become, as mentioned at the outset of my presentation, a creature of law, a landscape on which has been imposed a conglomeration of legal spaces of different types. There's one more legal space, though, that absolutely has to be considered before I wrap up, and that is Grand Canyon sculptor, the Colorado River. To be clear, it's this space that I'm talking about. Through there. Powell's vision for the Colorado River Basin, including that space, was one where there would be several of his watershed commonwealths carved out in this geographic area. What we ended up with, though, was slightly more fragmented on one hand and slightly more integrated on the other. A body of laws called the Law of the River controls the flow of the river in Grand Canyon and elsewhere across the Colorado River Basin. It treats as the dividing point of the basin an artificial line carved out here at Leaf Ferry, north of which is the upper basin, including Wyoming, south of which is the lower basin, primarily within Arizona. How exactly has the Law of the River come to control the Colorado River in Grand Canyon? One major development is pictured here. The formation of the Colorado River Compact in 1922 by this group of white gentlemen, the Colorado River Commission. The compact is considered the law of the river's constitution, and the flows of the Colorado River in Grand Canyon hinge directly on two legal obligations imposed by the Colorado River Compact, both of which apply at the spot that I identified a minute ago, Leaf Ferry. I don't expect you to read this text that fast, but I'll summarize it. This imposes an international flow obligation. This is Article 3C of the Colorado River Compact. It requires the upper basin states to contribute flows to Mexico under a 1944 treaty formed between the United States and Mexico. They got to be delivered at Leaf Ferry. This second provision sets forth another obligation. It requires the upper basin states to avoid causing the Colorado River flows at Leaf Ferry, directly upstream of Grand Canyon, really the beginning of Grand Canyon National Park, to avoid causing those flows to drop below 75 million acre feet during any consecutive 10-year period. These Leaf Ferry flow obligations imposed by the Colorado River Compact directly affect what the river looks like in Grand Canyon. But there's another strand of the law of the river that we're going to go into for a minute, and that concerns a subject that I know is really sexy and we all love, plumbing. In 1928, the Boulder Canyon Project Act authorized construction of Hoover Dam and the impoundment of the Colorado River into Lake Mead adjacent to the foot of Grand Canyon. In turn, in 1956, the Colorado River Storage Project Act, another major federal statute, authorized the construction of Glen Canyon Dam and the impoundment of the Colorado River into a reservoir called Lake Powell, right upstream, directly upstream of Leaf Ferry and Grand Canyon. And not to be outdone, in 1968, the Colorado River Basin Project Act required the Secretary of the Interior to develop an operating regime for Lake Powell that would ensure those flow obligations I mentioned a minute ago, the Leaf Ferry flow obligations under the Colorado River Compact, that they would actually be met as a matter of federal law. In addition, the Colorado River Project Act authorized the construction of a multi-tentacled octopus, the Central Arizona Project, pictured here. This piece of water infrastructure has spawned modern Phoenix. Where would electricity from the Central Arizona Project come from? One thing the Colorado River Basin Project Act almost did, but thankfully didn't, was to authorize construction of dams at the head and the foot of Grand Canyon National Park, Marble Canyon and Bridge Canyon dams, respectively. But instead, nothing's perfect in this world, in this life. We live in shades of gray. We got this. Central Arizona Project's power would come from the Navajo Generating Station, a coal-fired power plant located adjacent to Grand Canyon with resulting impacts on the canyon's air quality, as discussed in the previous section of my presentation. Beyond the compact and the plumbing laws, there's one more elephant in the room that has to be brought to light if we're talking about how federal law shapes the Colorado River and Grand Canyon. It's this piece. The Grand Canyon Protection Act, enacted in 1992. To provide a little bit of context, Glen Canyon Dam's impacts on the Grand Canyon ecosystem became increasingly concerning after the dam's completion and the reservoir's filling. In the early 1990s, stemming from major environmental studies on this subject, Congress enacted the Grand Canyon Protection Act while Bruce Babbitt, Flagstaff native, was Secretary of the Interior. The Grand Canyon Protection Act requires the Secretary, then Babbitt, to operate Glen Canyon Dam in a way that protects Grand Canyon National Park, or at least the values for which Grand Canyon National Park were designated. At the same time, the Grand Canyon Protection Act also requires the Secretary to conform Glen Canyon Dam's operation to all the allocation laws, Colorado River Compact, and to all the plumbing laws, Boulder Canyon Project Act, Colorado River Storage Project Act, Colorado River Basin Project Act, not to mention the Upper Basin Compact, U.S.-Mexico Treaty with Mexico, and the Arizona versus California Decree. The Secretary has to take all of that together and figure out a way to operate Glen Canyon Dam in a way that obliges the values for which Grand Canyon National Park was designated back in 1919. If that's not a dual mandate, I don't know what is. So, to fulfill this dual mandate, in 1995, an environmental impact statement was prepared as required again by federal law, the National Environmental Policy Act, that called for a host of measures related to Colorado River flows in Grand Canyon, as well as an adaptive management program. I'm not going to dig into those weeds right now, and the reason is, if we go forward 20 years, that EIS ended up getting superseded. After 20 years of observations, under the 1995 Environmental Impact Statement, a new operating regime was adopted in 2016. It's called the LTEMP, the Long-Term Experimental and Management Plan for Glen Canyon Dam. It calls for all the measures noted on this slide. Restrictions on monthly release volumes from the dam. Maybe more importantly, restrictions on the fluctuations in releases from the dam on a daily basis, up-ramping and down-ramping. Protection for endangered fish within the canyon, particularly a humpback chub population, and particularly in regards to its relationship with the blue ribbon trout fishery. Can we have both? Can they coexist? In addition, the LTEMP Alternative D calls for high flow experiments. There have been 8 done in total, the first of which dated from the mid-1990s. The most recent was from this past year. This is when the gates of Glen Canyon Dam really open up and Lake Powell flows through it. And the point is to try to get sediment into Grand Canyon, particularly as deposited from the Paria River, so that you can benefit the native ecology for the fish and otherwise, as well as benefit recreationalists, commercial outfitters and otherwise. Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program, again, as established through the 1995 EIS, also is going to continue its life as a governmental entity, specifically a federal advisory commission, its working group, going forward under this document, the LTEMP. All right, that's a lot to take in. What I'll say overall, there's a historian at Stanford by the name of Richard White. He worked at University of Utah. He worked at University of Washington before he got to Stanford. He wrote a book in the 1990s about the Columbia River. It was really fascinating. I think about this book in relation to the LTEMP, into the Colorado River Compact, the Boulder Canyon Project, etc. Richard White called the Columbia River in his book an organic machine. I think the same label fits this river system in modern times as a function of federal law. So that's a survey of how law has constructed Grand Canyon into various legal spaces since the National Park Centennial, or since the National Park's designation, in 1919, a little bit prior too. Hopefully it provides an interesting Centennial perspective. I'd love to field questions and comments. Thanks.
How were the native fish determined? I mean, what year does it go back to say that it's native?
Yeah, so they're native, right? I'm not a fish scientist. I can say a few things from a legal perspective. The native fish are designated that way because they're considered endemic to the Grand Canyon, to the Colorado River Basin, which means that the pre-dam conditions where you had super salty water, sediment water, warm flows generally, those are the type of conditions that cause those species to only originate on Earth within the Colorado River Basin ecosystem. Precisely when the scientists discovered their uniqueness in that respect, can't say. In terms of when federal law recognized them as such, 1960s. Stuart Udall, related to the person, the Mormon patriarch after whom Lee Ferry is named. He was Secretary of the Interior in the 60s, and under a predecessor statute to the Endangered Species Act, listed 2 of 4 endemic species that ultimately would be considered endangered in the Colorado River Basin. Fast forward in time, the Endangered Species Act came on the scene in 1973, and what we got in modern times, 4 listed endemic species: humpback chub, bony tail, Colorado pike minnow, and razorback sucker. And those are all covered by the Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program based out of Lakewood, Colorado's federal center. They have a presence elsewhere throughout the basin too. Some of you folks maybe heard of them. So that's more of a legal answer to your question.
Jason, talk about climate change and the future of the Colorado.
Yeah, so I guess I would be neglectful in not thinking about Grand Canyon's Centennial in relation to that subject. Climate change can be thought of in relation to the tribes, in relation to the public lands, and in relation to the river system itself. The area where I've worked the most is the connection between the tribes and the river system. So we've got a river system that was originally divvied out based on flawed numbers. The Colorado River Compact in 1922 divvied out water based on technical flow data that ended up being inflated, or more precisely ended up being based on a very wet period in the basin's history. It's hard when you create property rights based on faulty technical data, but that's what happened. Since 2000, that discrepancy between the river system's flows and the laws divvying out of those flows is maybe as pronounced as it has ever been. The basin's hydrology since 2000 is doing something that's never been seen in recorded history. That goes back to the late 1800s. In fact, the hydrological conditions in the basin are as severe as anything we've seen from tree ring studies going back maybe 1,200 years. It's for real. Go to the Wind River glaciers. Go talk to folks over at Western Wyoming Community College about what's happened to those glaciers if you don't believe me. It's happening now. The basin's hydrology has shifted. The past 20 years show it. And there's not a damn water manager in the basin, in the most conservative portion of the basin, that's going to deny that science. That's on. And we need to accept it, and we need to come to terms with it. Now, as that relates to the Indian tribes, it's unfortunate that climate change is squeezing the juice out of the basin at the same time that there are more than a dozen tribes with treaties or treaty equivalents that have never required the establishment and quantification of tribal water rights under federal law. You've got documents that on paper entitle, again, more than a dozen tribes to water for the reservations, for drinking water, for toilets, for culinary water. And those 12 tribes in the 21st century still don't have federal law honoring those obligations. So you've got a basin squeezed by climate change in a situation where you've got more than a dozen tribes with unquantified and unrecognized tribal water rights. If that's not a recipe for disaster, I don't know what is. And I'll take it one step further. Even tribes that have had their water rights quantified and recognized under federal law they haven't used the full amount of water that they're entitled to. You know about this in relation to Wind River. Those tribes have a water right to about 500,000 acre-feet of water use annually. Historically, they've used maybe half of that. It's one thing to have a paper right, it's another thing to have wet water. Same thing in the Colorado River Basin. Even for tribes that have quantified and recognized tribal water rights, they haven't utilized them in full. So you've got a boatload of tribes with underutilized water rights. You have another boatload of tribes with unquantified and unrecognized tribal water rights, and all of this is taking place in circumstances where climate change is definitely squeezing the juice out of the Colorado River Basin. I'm really passionate about that. I can tell, I know that probably comes out, but I'll restrain myself there. What do you got?
So from the talk that we had last night, yours,
I remember that guy.
yeah, he told me that the Indians, how am I going to say it? What you're saying is that they have legal rights to their water, but we're not giving it to them. So how, in the sense of him saying last night that they didn't have basically so much rights in it,
Yep.
I understood. How do we fix this situation?
Okay. You want me to be prescriptive? Yeah, so I'll say a couple things about it. So it's kind of like this. I'm going to give you title to a piece of land. Better yet, I'm going to give you title to a gold mine in Nevada. But you're never going to see the gold mine. You're just going to have to trust me that it's there. That's the situation that some of the tribes face when they've got reservations created through executive orders or treaties that say implicitly water is part of what was reserved in conjunction with that law. You can't have a homeland in the arid West if you don't have water. So the federal government's going to create a reservation. Implicit within that is you're going to need to have water in order for that reservation to be worth a damn, right?
He said last night, if you don't use it, you lose it.
That's a different area of water law called the prior appropriation doctrine. Let me go directly back to what you're saying, though. So it's one thing on paper to give tribes a piece of paper, on paper to give tribes a quote-unquote title, a piece, and say, look, we're not going to quantify or recognize the water rights that are embodied within this piece of paper. That's the situation that 12 tribes find themselves in the basin. It's another thing to maybe recognize and maybe set aside some flows based on a piece of paper that's been given, but then the tribes not have the capacity to build a canal or to build pipes or to build water treatment or anything that's actually needed for that wet water to be available so they can feed their kids breakfast in the morning at home or use the toilet, things like that, right? Those are the two camps, I guess, that I would say basin tribes find themselves within. There's the camp that has these documents that have never had water rights recognized, quantified in relation to. Who knows? There's this other camp where you got the documents that establish the rights, quantify them, but then there's actually not the capacity to take the water from the river into the communities. So they end up being underutilized. What do you do about both in both situations? The unquantified, unrecognized tribal water rights, they exist like a cloud in the Colorado River Basin, a big rain cloud. And I don't care if you're a native person or if you're a non-Indian water user. You don't want that hanging over the basin. Those need to be addressed. Those tribal water rights that haven't yet been quantified and haven't yet been recognized, those need addressing by the federal government and the basin states in which the reservations are located. The Navajo Nation, with a reservation the size of West Virginia, is one such tribe. And Arizona needs to sit down with them and figure out what works in relation to the Little Colorado River, perhaps otherwise. So there needs to be what I believe the best pathway, negotiated settlements. That just like other deals, you hammer out. You go back and forth in relation to, tribes get some of what they want, other folks get some of what they want, and we all call it good based on the art of compromise. That's what needs to be done. Thank you.